Julian Blake had everything: power, success, and complete control over his life. But when two young boys walked into his boardroom asking for their mother, everything changed. Their mother's name? Naomi Holloway. A woman he hadn't seen in 10 years. A woman who once meant everything to him. And the moment he looked at the boys, he knew, this wasn't just a coincidence, Julian Blake sat at the head of a long glass conference table, his fingers steepled together as he listened to the negotiation unfold. The room, perched high above Manhattan in his company's sleek skyscraper, was filled with powerful executives, each of them carefully measuring their words, knowing that one wrong move could cost them millions. The stakes were high, but Julian thrived in moments like this. He had built Blake Industries from the ground up, transforming it into a dominant force in finance and real estate. He was a man of precision, control, and strategy. Nothing in his world happened by chance. The lead negotiator on the other side of the table finished his pitch, and Julian let the silence stretch for a moment. It was a tactic he had mastered over the years, waiting just long enough to make people uncomfortable, to make them second-guess their own words. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm yet authoritative, delivering his counteroffer with the confidence of a man who knew he was already winning. Just as he was about to press further, the large mahogany doors of the conference room swung open abruptly. Every head in the room turned. Julian frowned, irritated by the interruption. His assistant was meticulous. She would never allow such a disruption unless it was absolutely urgent. But instead of one of his employees, two young boys stepped hesitantly inside. They looked no older than 8 or 9, both neatly dressed but visibly out of place among a room full of corporate giants. The taller of the two, with tight curls and a serious expression, glanced around before locking eyes with Julian. There was something unsettlingly familiar about his face, though Julian couldn't quite place why. "Excuse me," the boy said, his voice steady despite the weight of a dozen curious gazes. "We're looking for our mom." A murmur of confusion spread around the table. Julian's assistant, who had hurried in behind the boys, looked mortified as she stepped forward. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blake. I tried to stop them, but they were very insistent." Julian waved a dismissive hand, signaling for her to stand down, then turned his attention back to the boys. "Who is your mother?" The second boy, slightly shorter with an inquisitive gaze, spoke up this time. "Her name is Naomi Holloway." Julian's breath caught in his throat. Naomi Holloway. A name he hadn't heard in 10 years. A name he never expected to hear again. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt the ground beneath him shift. His carefully constructed world, the one he had spent years building, suddenly felt unstable. He cleared his throat, regaining his composure, though his mind raced. "Your mother is supposed to be here." The taller boy nodded. "She said she has a meeting with Julian Blake." "That's you, right?" Julian barely heard the whispered reactions from the executives around him. His mind was fixated on one thing, the possibility that Naomi Holloway, the woman he had once loved and lost, was somewhere in this very building. And if these boys were looking for her, if they bore even the slightest resemblance to the face that had haunted his past, then there was a much bigger question that he wasn't ready to ask. Before he could say another word, the doors opened once more. And there she was. Naomi Holloway stood in the doorway, tall and composed, her dark curls cascading over her shoulders. She looked different but somehow exactly the same, confident, poised, and in complete control of herself. Her deep brown eyes scanned the room before settling on him. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she broke the silence. "Julian," she said, her voice careful, measured, unreadable. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to keep his voice even. "Naomi." His heart pounded as the realization fully settled in. She was back. And these boys who had walked into his meeting so casually, so unknowingly, were her sons. The only question that remained was whether they were his too. Julian felt a strange, unfamiliar tightness in his chest as he stared at Naomi. It had been 10 years since he had last seen her, 10 years since they had stood in the same room, yet at that moment, it felt like no time had passed at all. She was still breathtaking, still carried herself with the quiet confidence that had drawn him to her in the first place. But there was something else now, something sharper in her gaze, as if she was bracing for a storm. The two boys, her sons, stood between them, watching the exchange with curiosity. Julian forced himself to focus, to push past the shock and find his voice. "I wasn't expecting this," he said, his voice steady but laced with unspoken questions. Naomi's expression remained unreadable. "Neither was I." Julian glanced at the boys again. "They said you have a meeting with me." She nodded, shifting her weight slightly. "Yes, I do. But I didn't plan for them to be here." She turned to the boys, her voice soft but firm. "Jaden, Kai, what are you doing here? You were supposed to wait in the lounge." The taller one, Jaden, lifted his chin. "We got bored. And we wanted to see you." Kai, the younger one, looked from his mother to Julian, his curious gaze lingering on him a little longer. "Who's he?" Julian felt the impact of that question hit him harder than he had expected. Naomi hesitated, her lips pressing together. She turned back to Julian, as if deciding whether she owed him an explanation. "I think we should talk," she finally said. Julian exhaled, running a hand over his jaw before nodding. "Let's go somewhere private." He looked at his assistant, who was still standing near the door, eyes wide with uncertainty. "Reschedule the rest of my meetings," he instructed. "This takes priority." She nodded quickly and exited the room. Julian turned back to Naomi and the boys. "Come with me." He led them out of the conference room, his mind racing with possibilities, questions forming faster than he could process them. He had spent the last decade immersed in business, in carefully curated deals and structured plans. Yet nothing in his years of negotiations had prepared him for what was happening now. Inside his private office, a spacious, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, he gestured for them to sit. Naomi remained standing for a moment before finally taking a seat across from him, her posture guarded. The boys hesitated, then climbed onto the leather couch near the window. Julian looked at Naomi, exhaling slowly. "I need you to tell me the truth." She met his gaze without wavering. "I always tell the truth." He leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "Are they mine?" Naomi's fingers tightened slightly against the armrest of her chair. For a brief moment, something flickered in her expression, something like hesitation, maybe even regret. Then she nodded. "Yes, Julian. They're yours." The words settled over him like a heavy weight, the truth sinking in deeper than he thought possible. His sons. For 8 years, they had existed in the world without him knowing. For 8 years, he had gone on with his life, believing he was alone, believing that the only thing that mattered was the empire he was building. Now, all of that seemed so insignificant. He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face as he tried to process everything. "Why didn't you tell me?" Naomi's gaze softened slightly, but there was still steel in her voice. "Because you made your choice, Julian. Back then, your career was everything. You had no room for distractions. You told me that yourself." He clenched his jaw, remembering those words. He had been younger, blinded by ambition, convinced that love and relationships were secondary to success. Had he really made her believe that she and their children would have been nothing more than a distraction? "That was 10 years ago," he said, his voice lower now. "I would have wanted to know." Naomi sighed, shaking her head. "Would you? Or would you have resented us for disrupting your perfect life?" Julian didn't have an immediate answer. Jaden and Kai had been listening quietly, but now Jaden spoke up, his tone careful. So, does that mean you're our dad? Julian's throat tightened. He looked at his son, his son and felt an unfamiliar kind of fear settle in. Yes, he said, his voice steadied despite the emotions warring inside him. I am. Kai frowned, his small hands gripping the edge of the couch. Then where were you? The question cut deeper than he expected. He swallowed hard, meeting their expectant gazes. I didn't know, he admitted. I didn't know you existed. Kai seemed to process that, his brows furrowing slightly before he nodded, as if deciding that answer was acceptable for now. Naomi watched the interaction, her expression softer than before. This changes things, Julian, she said quietly. I've raised them alone for 8 years. They don't know you. You can't just walk in and expect everything to fall into place overnight. Julian nodded, already knowing she was right. He had spent his life making quick decisions, fixing problems with money and power. But this wasn't a deal to negotiate. This was his family. And if he wanted a place in his sons' lives, he would have to earn it. Julian sat in his office long after Naomi and the boys had left, staring out at the New York skyline. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him in a way that no business deal ever had. He was a father. He had 2 sons who had grown up without him, who didn't even know his name until today. The thought sent a strange ache through his chest, one he didn't quite know how to process. His entire life had been built on calculated risks, on making the right moves at the right time. But now, he was standing at the edge of something completely foreign, something that required more than strategy and logic. He had spent the last decade believing his work was his legacy, the empire he had built was what mattered most. But now, he realized his greatest achievement had been living in this world without him even knowing. He needed to do something. The next morning, he made a decision. If he was going to be part of Jaden and Kai's lives, he couldn't sit back and wait for things to fall into place. He had to take action. He picked up his phone and called Naomi. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cautious. Julian. I want to see them again, he said without hesitation. Not in an office. Somewhere normal. Naomi sighed on the other end of the line. They're still processing everything. I don't want to rush them. I understand, he said. But I don't want to be a stranger to them. I don't expect them to accept me overnight, but I want to start. There was a pause before she responded. I'm taking them to the park this afternoon. If you want to come, you can. But no pressure, Julian. They need time. I'll be there, he said without hesitation. That afternoon, he arrived at the park earlier than he needed to, feeling uncharacteristically anxious. The place was full of families, parents pushing strollers, kids laughing as they chased each other across the grass. He had never really taken the time to notice things like this before. His world had always been centered around boardrooms and high-rise buildings, not playgrounds and picnic tables. Then, he saw them. Naomi was sitting on a bench, watching as Jaden and Kai ran toward the swings. They looked so carefree, so full of energy, and for a moment, Julian felt like an outsider looking into a world he didn't quite belong to yet. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He walked over, and Naomi looked up at him with a small nod. You actually came. I told you I would, he said, sitting down beside her. They watched in silence for a moment as the boys played. Julian felt a strange mix of emotions, pride, regret, hope. He had missed so much. He didn't even know what their laughter sounded like until now. After a few minutes, Kai noticed him first. He stopped mid-swing, tilting his head as he looked at Julian. Hey, it's you. Julian smiled, trying to hide how nervous he suddenly felt. It's me. Jaden joined his brother, looking between him and Naomi before crossing his arms. Why are you here? Julian met his son's gaze, knowing that honesty was the only way forward. Because I want to get to know you. If you'll let me. Jayden studied him for a long moment before shrugging. I guess that's okay. Kai, on the other hand, grinned. Do you know how to play soccer? Julian chuckled, relieved by the shift in energy. I used to. Might be a little rusty. Kai's face lit up. We'll teach you. Jayden rolled his eyes but didn't protest. Naomi, beside Julian, let out a small breath, as if she had been holding it this whole time. That's a good start, she murmured. Julian nodded, watching as his sons ran toward the field, motioning for him to follow. It wasn't everything. But it was a start. Julian had never considered himself an anxious man. He had faced ruthless business rivals, closed multi-million-dollar deals under pressure, and made decisions that affected thousands of employees without breaking a sweat. But standing on the soccer field with Jayden and Kai, he felt a nervousness unlike anything he had ever experienced. These boys weren't just potential business partners or clients, they were his sons, Kai bounced on his toes, full of energy, while Jayden stood slightly behind him, more reserved but clearly watching Julian carefully. Naomi leaned against the fence, arms crossed as she observed, offering him no help but also no discouragement. This was a test, and he knew it. Kai kicked the soccer ball toward Julian, grinning. Okay, let's see if you're any good. Julian stopped the ball with the inside of his foot, something that surprised even him. It had been years since he'd played, and he was sure he wasn't going to impress them with his skills. But that wasn't the point. This wasn't about being the best, it was about showing up. He dribbled the ball forward, feigning a move to the left before sending it rolling back toward Kai. The boy laughed and darted after it, effortlessly maneuvering around Julian before kicking it toward his brother. Jayden caught it with his foot and studied Julian for a moment before finally making a move, passing it back to him. Something shifted in that moment. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic breakthrough, but it was an opening, a sign that maybe, just maybe, Jayden was willing to give him a chance. For the next 30 minutes, they played, Julian chasing after them, failing miserably at defending against their quick footwork, but laughing the whole time. He hadn't realized how much he missed this, the simplicity of play, the joy of something that wasn't about money or power, After a particularly embarrassing fall when he tried to block one of Kai's shots, Julian sat down on the grass, breathing heavily. I think I'm too old for this, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. Kai plopped down beside him, grinning. You're not that old. Jayden hesitated before sitting down too, though he kept some distance. Naomi, seeing the moment unfold, made her way over, carrying a bottle of water, which she handed to Julian. He took it, nodding in thanks. You did better than I expected, she admitted. Julian smirked. That sounds like a compliment. She shrugged. Take it however you want. Kai looked between them, then asked curiously, how do you guys know each other? Naomi glanced at Julian before answering. We knew each other a long time ago. Jayden frowned slightly. So, if you knew each other, how come you weren't around before? The question hit harder than Julian expected. He felt Naomi shift beside him, as if bracing for his response. Julian turned to Jayden, meeting his gaze directly. Because I didn't know, he said honestly. I didn't know about you and Kai. Jayden didn't break eye contact, and for a second, Julian thought he would argue. But instead, the boy looked away, nodding slightly as if trying to process the information. Kai, however, wasn't as patient. But now that you know, are you gonna stay? Julian felt the weight of the question settle in the air. He knew the easy answer would be to say yes, but words meant nothing without actions. He had spent his life making promises in the corporate world, but this wasn't business, this was personal, and it was something he couldn't afford to fail. I want to, he said finally. I know I have a lot to prove, but I want to be here. If you'll let me. Kai seemed satisfied with that answer, nodding enthusiastically. Jaden, however, remained quiet. Naomi watched both of them carefully before finally speaking. Let's take it one step at a time, she said softly. Julian nodded, knowing that was the best he could hope for. One step at a time. And this time, he wouldn't run. Julian had always been good at adapting. It was one of the reasons he had been so successful in business. He knew how to read a room, how to shift strategies when necessary, and how to adjust his approach to get the best possible outcome. But this situation was unlike anything he had ever faced before. There was no playbook for reconnecting with the children you never knew you had. Over the next few weeks, he made it his priority to be present. He wasn't naive enough to think he could instantly become a father to Jaden and Kai, but he could at least start by showing up. Naomi had made it clear from the beginning that there were no shortcuts. He had to earn their trust, and that would take time. He started small. He took them out for ice cream after school one day, letting them each pick their own flavors while he listened to their conversations. Kai was the talkative one, excitedly telling him about a science project he was working on. Jaden was more reserved, answering questions when asked but mostly observing, as if still trying to figure Julian out. One evening, Naomi invited him over for dinner. It wasn't a formal occasion, just a simple meal at her apartment, but to Julian, it felt like a milestone. When he arrived, the smell of homemade food filled the air, something he hadn't experienced in years. His life had been built around business dinners, expensive restaurants, and meals eaten alone in luxury penthouses. But this was different. It was warm, personal, and unfamiliar in a way that made him realize just how much he had been missing. Kai pulled him toward the dining table, excitedly showing off his drawing from school. I made this today. It's a spaceship, but I made it cooler with extra engines. Julian took the paper, genuinely impressed. That's pretty amazing. Are you planning to be an astronaut? Kai grinned. Maybe. Or a scientist. Or a soccer player. I haven't decided yet. Julian chuckled. Well, you've got time to figure it out. Jaden sat at the table, quietly watching them. Julian turned to him, trying to include him without pressuring him. What about you, Jaden? Any big plans? Jaden shrugged, twirling his fork in his food. I don't know yet. Naomi glanced at her older son before speaking. Jaden likes to read a lot. He's always been curious about how things work. Julian nodded. That's a good thing. The world needs people who ask questions. Jaden looked up at him for a moment before turning back to his plate. It wasn't much, but it was something. After dinner, Julian helped clean up, feeling an odd sense of normalcy settle over him. This wasn't his world, at least, not yet, but he wanted it to be. As he stood by the sink drying dishes, Naomi leaned against the counter beside him. You're trying, she said softly. Julian looked over at her. Is it working? She exhaled, crossing her arms. Kai adores you already. Jaden, he's more cautious. I've noticed, Julian admitted. He's smart. He doesn't just accept things at face value. Naomi nodded. He's always been like that. He's careful with his trust. He doesn't want to get hurt. Julian felt the weight of those words. He had already missed 8 years of their lives. He didn't want to give them a reason to doubt him now. I'm not going anywhere, he said quietly. Naomi studied him for a long moment before nodding. Good. That night, as he left, Julian realized something. For the first time in years, his goals weren't just about business. He wanted something more. And he was willing to fight for it. Julian had spent his life making calculated decisions. Every move he made in business was deliberate, backed by research, logic, and a clear strategy. But when it came to Jaden and Kai, there was no clear strategy to follow. There were no guarantees, no formulas for success. All he could do was show up and hope that, with time, they would let him in. The following weekend, he took them to a basketball game. He had gotten box seats, thinking they would enjoy the luxury, but as soon as they arrived, Kai insisted they sit closer to the court. Julian hesitated at first, unused to being in a crowd rather than a private section, but when he saw the excitement in Kai's eyes, he gave in. Kai was glued to the action, jumping up every time a player made a shot, while Jaden sat beside them, more reserved but clearly interested. Julian could tell he was paying attention to the details of the game, analyzing strategies rather than just enjoying the excitement. At halftime, Julian bought them snacks, watching as Kai devoured his popcorn while Jaden carefully unwrapped a chocolate bar. "This is cool," Kai said between bites. "I've never been this close before." Julian smiled. "Then we'll have to do this more often." Jaden glanced up at him, then back at the game. "You're really trying, huh?" Julian met his gaze, surprised by the directness of the question. "Yeah. I am." Jaden was quiet for a moment before nodding slightly. "Okay." It wasn't a full acceptance, but it was something. Later that evening, when he dropped them off at Naomi's apartment, Kai ran inside, already talking about the game, but Jaden lingered at the door. He looked at Julian, as if debating whether to say something. "Good night," Julian said, keeping his tone casual. Jaden hesitated, then finally spoke. "Do you regret not knowing about us sooner?" The question hit Julian harder than he expected. He exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "I regret not being there for you. If I had known, nothing would have stopped me from being part of your lives." Jaden studied him, searching for any sign of dishonesty. After a moment, he nodded again, as if filing the information away for later. "Good night," he said before heading inside. As Julian walked back to his car, he realized something. Jaden might not say much, but he was paying attention to everything. And slowly, he was letting Julian in. It was more than Julian could have hoped for. As they strolled through the park, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the path. The air was crisp, carrying the distant laughter of children playing and the rhythmic rustling of leaves as a gentle breeze swept through the trees. Julian walked slightly behind the boys, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, observing them as they chatted between themselves. Jaden was more reserved, listening intently while Kai talked animatedly about a soccer game he had played in school. Julian found himself drawn to their easy camaraderie, fascinated by the way their personalities balanced each other so naturally. Kai, never one to stay still for too long, suddenly ran ahead, kicking a small rock along the pavement as if it were a soccer ball. He turned back to glance at Julian before slowing his pace to fall in step beside him. His expression, usually filled with boundless energy, was unusually serious. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, chewing on his lower lip, before finally speaking. "Are you going to stay with us forever?" The question caught Julian off guard. He stopped walking, momentarily stunned, before composing himself and looking down at the boy standing beside him. Jaden had stopped too, his dark eyes watching Julian carefully, though he said nothing. The weight of Kai's question settled deep in Julian's chest, heavier than he expected. He knew that behind the innocent words was a deeper, unspoken fear, a doubt that had been lingering in their minds. He realized that no matter how much effort he had put into getting to know them, they still weren't sure if he was here to stay. He crouched down to Kai's level, resting his hands on his knees as he met the boy's gaze. He could see the uncertainty there, mixed with hope and a reluctance to trust too easily. He had missed a decade of their lives. He had not been there to tuck them in at night, to cheer them on at their games, to comfort them when they were sick. He had not been there when they needed a father, and now, despite how much he wanted to make up for lost time, he understood that words alone wouldn't be enough. "Yes," he said without hesitation, his voice steady and sure. "I'm staying. Forever." Kai searched his face for any hint of doubt, and when he found none, his lips curved into a small smile. He didn't say anything else, but the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his fingers clenched briefly into the fabric of Julian's coat before letting go, told Julian everything he needed to know. Jaden, still quiet, gave a single nod, acknowledging the moment in his own way before looking away as if to compose himself. Julian stood back up, glancing at Naomi, who had been watching from a short distance away. Their eyes met, and he saw something shift in her expression. Maybe it was relief, maybe it was cautious optimism, but whatever it was, he knew it meant that he had taken another step forward, not just with the boys, but with her too. Kai, now back to his usual self, took Julian's hand for just a moment before quickly letting go and dashing ahead again. Julian felt a warmth spread through his chest as he watched him go, feeling, for the first time in his life, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. That evening, after Jaden and Kai had fallen asleep in the guest room of Julian's penthouse, Naomi stood by the large window, looking out at the city skyline. The soft glow of the streetlights reflected against the glass, and in the distance, the hum of traffic filled the silence. She had always loved the view from high places, the way the world stretched endlessly in every direction, a constant reminder that life moved forward no matter what. But tonight, instead of bringing her comfort, it made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something unfamiliar, something uncertain. She heard Julian approaching before he spoke, his footsteps quiet against the hardwood floor. He stopped beside her, hands in his pockets, his gaze following hers out the window. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, a mixture of emotions neither of them seemed ready to untangle. It had been a long day, one filled with moments she never thought she would have to face. Seeing Julian with their sons, watching the way he had begun to carve out a space for himself in their lives, had been more than she had ever prepared for. After a while, he finally broke the silence. "They didn't want to leave," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Kai tried to pretend he wasn't tired, and Jaden kept looking at me like he was trying to figure out if I meant what I said earlier. Naomi smiled slightly, though there was something sad about it. "They're still waiting to see if you'll change your mind." Julian turned to her then, his expression serious. "I won't." She exhaled slowly, crossing her arms over her chest. "It's not that simple, Julian. You're here now, and that means something. But being a father isn't just about showing up. It's about consistency, about proving to them over and over again that you're not going to walk away." She hesitated before adding, "because they've already learned what it feels like to not have you." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked away, as if the weight of those words was something he had to physically carry. "I know," he admitted. "And I hate that I wasn't there. But I can't change what happened. I can only change what happens next." She studied him carefully, searching for any sign of doubt, but all she saw was determination. It was strange, seeing him like this, so open, so vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. The Julian she remembered had been consumed by ambition, by a hunger for success that had left no room for anything else. The man standing in front of her now was still powerful, still relentless, but there was something different in his eyes, something she wasn't sure she was ready to trust. Taking a breath, she shifted her gaze back out to the city, the lights flickering like stars against the darkness. "I need to know something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you had known back then, would you have chosen us?" He didn't hesitate, didn't even take a second to consider his answer. "I can't change the past, Naomi. But now, I choose you. I choose them. I choose our family." She felt something deep inside her chest tighten, an ache that had lived there for years, built from memories of late nights alone, of birthdays celebrated without him, of the quiet strength it had taken to raise two boys on her own. She had convinced herself that she didn't need him, that she had done just fine without him. And yet, standing here, hearing him say those words, she couldn't deny that a part of her had always wanted to hear them. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the moment stretch between them, letting herself feel the weight of it, letting herself decide if she was willing to believe him. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, she reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his, squeezing gently. It wasn't an answer, not exactly, but it was something. A beginning. A chance. And as she stood there beside him, their hands clasped together, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that maybe this time, he wouldn't let them go. The ending of this story carries a deep emotional resonance, built on the themes of redemption, second chances, and the slow rebuilding of trust. What makes it particularly powerful is that it doesn't rush to a neatly wrapped resolution. Instead, it acknowledges that healing takes time and that words alone aren't enough, actions, consistency, and patience are what truly matter. Julian's journey from an ambitious, career-driven man to someone who understands the weight of fatherhood and love is compelling. He isn't just trying to claim his place in his sons' lives, he's willing to earn it. That's what makes his final declaration, choosing Naomi and their children, not just romantic but meaningful. He's no longer the man who walked away from love for the sake of success. He's someone who understands that real success is built in the quiet moments of connection, in the effort to stay, to show up, and to prove, again and again, that he belongs. Naomi's hesitance is also incredibly realistic. She isn't swept away by the idea of Julian suddenly returning and fixing everything. She's strong, cautious, and protective of the life she built. Her reaching for his hand at the end isn't a complete surrender, it's a test, a small step forward that says, I'm willing to try, but I need you to prove this to me, and that, to me, is the beauty of this ending. It leaves space for growth, for the possibility that love isn't just something you feel, but something you prove over time. This isn't just a love story between two people, it's a story about a man learning what it means to be a father, about two children learning to trust, and about a woman deciding whether she's willing to open her heart again. The ending is hopeful but grounded, offering the possibility of a future, but only if Julian continues to show, not just say, that he's truly here to stay.